My name is Max Gagliardi, and this is the Talk.Energy Podcast. If you're watching this video or listening, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button on YouTube or follow us on your favorite podcast app. This episode's guest is Alex Epstein, the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and the founder of the Center for Industrial Progress. Alex has a philosophy degree from Duke University and is widely known for his objectivism and using critical thinking to craft his arguments. Many may think of Alex as just an advocate of the fossil fuel industry, but in practical terms, fossil fuels are just a means to his end. Alex's true loyalty lies in whatever form of energy will bring prosperity and flourishing to the human condition around the world. This episode's filled with discussions of social media censorship, the paradoxes of modern energy, and if there's a possibility of fossil fuels and renewables to coexist. Hope you enjoy the show. Alex, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Hey, good to be here. I'm excited about this one.
So really excited to have you on, longtime fan, and not just because of the fossil fuels advocacy stuff, more so just the way you frame your arguments, the objectivism, just the way you think about a problem, and then how you try to break things down and support it with facts or objective facts. And that's just something I'm a huge fan of. It's how I try to look at things.
Well, you're building me up to the audience, so we better deliver here.
Yeah. Well, no, I think most people.
Because interestingly, those are things that I think most people participating in this debate think that they do.
Yeah.
So it's kind of there's always an interesting thing, sorry to interrupt, but there's always an interesting thing of like when you're in the minority, like, right. Why do you think you're right and other people are wrong? And so sometimes people think, oh, it's just the other side is stupid. And that's never my view. My view is always that there's a certain operating framework that people have that's ultimately wrong and that they couldn't really defend, but they don't know they're operating on it. And so that leads them to skewed views. So maybe that'll come. But as you described me, I thought, well, I think a lot of people would describe themselves that way. And yet you somehow don't agree that everyone is that way. And I certainly don't agree that everyone is that way, even if they claim to be objective.
No, and I think that a lot of energy and the debate around energy, and we'll get into it in this pod, hopefully, is that there's kind of this almost philosophical view of what is truth and what is false, and what are the arguments supporting that. And a lot of this in the energy space particularly plays on emotion. There's a lot of emotion involved. There's a lot of what I would call ideology. Other people may not call it that, but I feel like the way you view it in the arguments specifically that you make, or you try to back those up with facts, which leads well into the first question, which is in 2020, sometimes what some people would consider objective facts may be controversial to other people. And in your instance, some of the viewers may not know, but you were, I guess what I'll call censored. I don't know a better word to call it on LinkedIn for quoting or posting a quote from President-elect Joe Biden. And I'm going to read the quote so I don't get it wrong. But he said, "Climate change is the existential threat to humanity. Unchecked, it's going to actually bake this planet. This is not hyperbole. It's real. We have a moral obligation." In which you responded, "This is hyperbole. It's fake. We have a moral obligation to use more fossil fuels." And LinkedIn took down the post. And just walk me through first of all, how you found out that it was censored. What was your just initial emotion and how did you feel about that? And then how did you get it reinstated and what was the public response once you got it reinstated?
Sure. So I don't know if I would call it censored. I mean, they're a private organization, so they can do what they want. But I mean, they definitely suppressed it. They definitely took it down. And I forget how I found out. I think I was maybe I got an email from them, or it also was on the thing. Maybe I was wondering, why aren't I getting any response to this thing? And then it's, we deemed this non-factual. And it was, I think you gave the right emphasis when you read the quote. Like he just keeps saying these things that are just beyond extreme. Like it's actually going to bake the planet. It's not hyperbole. Like, what does it mean to bake something? I mean, it means to actually like burn it in a significant way. And we're talking about a planet in which the average temperature used to be 25 degrees higher for huge amounts of the planet's history. And there's no model anywhere that shows us getting anywhere near that. We have no means of increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere to the levels it used to be, even if we wanted to. So it's one thing to say, hey, I'm worried that the rate of change that we're causing by putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, that will be disruptive and there will be a bunch of negatives. But the idea of, the planet is going to be just this barren place, that contradicts everything we know about the history of the planet. It was a much more lush place when it was a lot warmer, and also particularly when it had a lot more CO2. So, I just felt like very confident in what I said. And I just thought, this is some person being paid $5 an hour to, quote, fact check. And that's part of what's going on with these issues, is people just think this is part of my point, that people often think if somebody disagrees with me, they're stupid. And so part of that view is, there are certain people who believe in science and there are certain people who don't believe in science. And so we just need the people who believe in science to be given a large editorial hand in the entire internet. And then everybody will see the scientific truth. That's certainly true that some people are anti-science, but usually in a modern intellectual environment, you have different people who have legitimately different interpretations of science. And then perhaps more importantly, they have a different integration of the science with other facts. And so you can just see it with something like the coronavirus. There's a wide variety of specialists who had very different estimates of how this would spread through the population, sure, what you could do about it. But then there's all these issues which were not sufficiently considered about what does locking people down do to every aspect of your life. And even if, two people agreed on the epidemiology, they might totally disagree on the policy. And maybe what this gets at is that it's actually very difficult to think objectively about things. And I think all things being equal, you want an environment of intellectual competition where different viewpoints are free to speak out and also to interact with one another. You want to figure out ways for them to interact with and often debate one another. And there's with any kind of issue that we're talking about today, certainly like energy, where it's such an interdisciplinary issue, there's no such thing where you're going to just get even a $100 an hour fact checker who's going to somehow properly editorialize the internet. So I was glad that I have this website, energytalkingpoints.com, which has a lot of references. So I was just able to cite a bunch of points there. And I guess the $7 an hour fact checkers said, this sounds okay, we'll put it back. And I do think that's an important thing, though. If there's a lot of one more thing about this, and then I'll be less long-winded. With the fact checking today very much has the imprimatur of science to it. And so there's a big necessity and opportunity. If you think this fact checking is wrong, or if you think the fact sharing is right. Like the other day, they shared just a political propaganda point from Joe Biden on Twitter, and it was the top of my science feed. It just, I didn't even follow him at the time. It just said science. And then Joe Biden said, when I think about climate change, I think about jobs. And I'm like, well, I disagree with this economically. You're going to raise the price of energy. That raises the price of all industry. Industry is going to flee your country. Like that happens over and over. But even if I don't agree, like how is this science? So Twitter is now saying, certain things are not science. And then Joe Biden's economic policy is science. But when we challenge that effectively with facts, there's a real opportunity to educate people, because it not only addresses the specific thing, but it addresses, hey, maybe we're in this kind of artificial bubble that we're being fed a certain narrative, and maybe that's not the only narrative consistent with the facts.
Yeah, that's a great segue into some of my next questions, which how do we, we've got this, we're in this era where there's more information than there's ever been. And I often joke that it took all the information at our fingertips to make people dumber. And it's just a joke, but it's like, who would have thought that the outcome from having literally every piece of information available to humans would make it harder than ever to weed through what is true and what is false. And as you think about energy and the policies and the arguments, a lot of this is really around what you just mentioned, what is objectively true. And so somebody who likes to frame your arguments in that way, how do you consider something misinformation when you go to find something or do research on a topic and to craft your argument? Where do you go? How do you do that? And what do you label as the gold standard for objective truth? Because that's a tough thing to figure out in today's era, where you can find plenty of arguments on both sides.
I think there are at least two important issues here that it's important to distinguish. So one is you can think of as information versus misinformation. And these are sort of direct claims to facts about reality that could be, and where somebody can say the truth and somebody could say something false. So it could be something like, okay, this mine, there was an explosion at this mine versus there wasn't an explosion at this mine, or something like even, Germany got 50% of its energy from solar and wind last year. Like that's a false claim. So that's misinformation. Although often even in misinformation, it's usually taking some information out of context. So it might have been yesterday, Germany got 50% of their electricity, not all of their energy, from solar and wind. And then somebody took that out of context and then made a statement that was misinformation. So that, in general, you want to look for, there are kind of nonpartisan international sources that in terms of raw data, raw information are pretty good. They're not perfect. And so the more serious you are, the more seriously engaged you are in the issue, the more you need to look at the methodology by which it was collected. And this happens whether you're looking at temperature records. I talk a lot about climate-related deaths, how many people are dying from climate, which is something that's gone down, not up, contrary to what most people suspect. But even there, when you get into the issues, it's like, okay, well, how do we know how many people died of heat in the 1920s?
Yeah.
Like there are, but those kinds of records tend to be, like the international nonpartisan sources tend to be good when it comes to factual documentation. The more it's an interpretation, like a broad interpretation of it, the more different kinds of biases and errors can fit in. So I'd say that in terms of information and misinformation. But I think the real issue is the issue of what framework are you using to find and integrate information. So I'll just give you part of my own story of this was I grew up in an environment, in a very, what we'd call liberal environment, where all I heard about fossil fuels were about the alleged negative side effects, primarily CO2 causing global warming, causing different kinds of negative climate changes. And that's an important thing to look at for sure. But I never learned about the benefits of fossil fuels. And then I started learning about the benefits of fossil fuels. And so the benefit of low cost, reliable, versatile energy that can be used by billions of people in thousands of places. And I learned, wow, this is really, to say the least, it's very important. This powers all the machines that do so much of the work that make our lives good. Without these machines, our lives would be really bad. And without these machines having food, namely energy, therefore our lives would be bad. And I didn't realize how important energy was, and then how uniquely good the fossil fuel industry was at producing it and how difficult that was to replicate it. And then that made me think, oh, there are these huge benefits of continuing fossil fuel use. Now that's the omission of that. So the failure to what I would call consider the full context, that's not primarily an issue of information versus misinformation. It's an issue of just disregarding certain categories of information because you in some way regard it as irrelevant. Now, sometimes that's ignorance, but when you're talking about the specialist, there's a reason why most people talking about fossil fuels today have very little interest in energy. For example, they're very uninterested in the fact that 3 billion people in the world have almost no energy. And my quick diagnosis of that is that's an issue of philosophy or framework. And part of what's going on is that people think that the planet is what I call a delicate nurturer. So it nurtures us. It exists in this stable and sufficient and safe state, but then it's delicate. So if we impact it a lot, everything's going to go haywire and we're going to go extinct. So insofar as that's your framework, you're not too focused on energy because you're just always worried that energy or any other form of industry is going to make the world end. So that's one thing. And then another thing is that value-wise, this is controversial, but I think it's inarguably true if you analyze it. People in their analysis, at least of energy and environmental issues, are not focused on human life very much as a value. Their main value is this idea of an unimpacted planet, that we should be as green as possible, that we should minimize our impact. And you can see this in energy, where the whole focus on energy is how green can we make our energy? And there's no interest in how abundant can we make energy. And so that kind of framing where your whole focus is on minimizing your impact and where you assume that impact is going to destroy all of us, that makes you uninterested in the, turns out, massive benefits of fossil fuels and of energy more broadly. So that's a case in the case I'm interested in, where people are not, like, even if they had all true information, they would only be looking at a sliver of the context. And so your framework determines what information you consider valuable, and then also what kinds of predictions you're going to make on the basis of that. So with climate, you could say, well, people think, well, we've increased the amount of CO2 from 0.03% to 0.04% of the atmosphere. If you believe the Earth is a delicate nurturer, you might think, oh, everything's going to go haywire. If you think the Earth is what I would call wild potential, where it's naturally dynamic and deficient and dangerous, and these kinds of changes happen all the time, then you might think, well, I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe it'll be bad, but maybe it'll be okay. Maybe it'll be good. I'm not going to be biased. So that's how framework totally affects your relationship to information, even if it's totally true.
Yeah, that's really good. A couple of things you said. One of them that's interesting that we'll talk about later, I've got a question on it, is that they just, the people that are opposed to fossil fuels, they just want to do things that are less of an impact on the planet. I don't know if that's exactly true. I think they've hyper-focused in on a few things like emissions, but we'll talk about later why we may think that
but
is.
It's the idea that, yeah, we can talk about that, but it's just, I just want to focus. It's the perception.
Right.
That it's true. I mean, it turns out that any time you're producing energy, you're having a massive impact, and the more dilute the energy, at least the broader impact you're going to have on the landscape, and in terms of the mining and stuff like that.
Well, you're right.
But it's definitely the idea of minimizing impact.
Exactly.
Is the appeal of these green sources.
Yeah, and so it's the ideal that's the appeal, and so that's a great. I've got one story where I was in college, and similar to you, I had a lot of viewpoints that I hadn't really explored. That you listen to a lot of things and you hear what people have to say, and it's very altruistic, and you think, okay, I want to do these things because they're good. And I had a paper I had to write on. I think it was something about recycling, and I went down this recycling rabbit hole. And I remember very early on, as I'm researching it, I started to think about it, and I thought, man, when I was younger, there was one set of big trucks that drove around my neighborhood that, blew CO2 into the air, and that really loud, and they clang around when they stop by your house, so you know that they're there. And, now that I'm older and we recycle, there's now 2 fleets of these big trucks that come around to my house and that emit the CO2 into the air. And so I thought, man, step 1 was double the carbon footprint, right? Step 1, before we even pick up this single piece of trash, we've now doubled it. In fact, maybe more than doubled it, because you're not even picking up all the trash. They're just picking up a little bit of your trash with a whole nother fleet of trucks. And so I started to go down this rabbit hole, and the paper went from like a pro recycling thing to a more questioning that why we're doing it. And that's probably a whole nother pod. But I think it's just like you said.
Well, that speaks well of you to have that experience. That's an unusual kind of thing to have that experience where, you go in. I mean, it shows that not to pay you too much of a compliment because I just met you, but like, it's a good thing in people when they're never too attached to a particular factual belief or even specific evaluation, where they're sort of more broadly interested in the truth. And then they're actually, it's kind of exciting if you discover you're wrong about something. And recycling is, if you want to discover something you're wrong about, recycling is a gold mine.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's a rabbit hole you can go pretty far down. I think it's becoming more mainstream that people are questioning where exactly these products are going. But like I said, you could do a whole pod. But who is like the arbiter of truth then, right? Because you've got these scientists that, let's face it, science in general is very academia driven. Which we all know is very affiliated to one political party in academia. And so I'm not going to say that it's biased, but you can follow some logic and understand that there is a certain type of community that science is in. And it's certainly not everybody. My dad is a scientist. He's a geologist and an engineer. And so I'm not lumping all science, but so that's one arbiter of truth. You've got policymakers, these people that are telling you all these things. And then if you disagree with them, like in your comment with, or your post of Joe Biden, then now all of a sudden you're going against what is truth. But does it really matter? Like if the masses all have a public perception, and this is kind of a philosophical thing that I struggle with, it's like you can sit here and throw all these facts at people. And sometimes I just sit back and I'm like, but if all these other people believe something, do the masses almost kind of decide what's true and false in some weird way with social media and the way things are today, just with the, how public opinion is?
Well, there's a lot there, but I mean, definitely what people believe determines what action happens.
Right.
And that's part of the reason why we care about what other people believe, particularly when the action is political, which means coercive, which ultimately means that we're being forced to do things against our will. So, yeah, I mean, but I mean, the thing is that, like, reality is objective in the sense that there are certain laws of cause and effect.
Sure.
And there are certain types of things that benefit human life and certain types of things that don't. So just to take an example I love to give, you think about what machines do, or I like to call it machine labor, like the work that machines do for us. So a modern combine harvester, one person using that can do 700 times more work, more food production than the best manual laborer could.
Right.
So you just think about how we've just become Superman. Like that's a cause and effect thing. So that person can reap and thresh enough wheat for something like 500,000 loaves of bread a day, like one person using this machine. Like that is a reality. And the reality is that they're only able to do that insofar as they can cost effectively produce the fuel for the machine, the food of the machine, but also produce the machine itself, which means producing the food for the hundreds of machines that go into producing that machine. And so what happens is if the energy, the machine food becomes expensive enough, then at a certain point, you can't use a combine harvester, or you can't use as many of them. You can't use as many machines in your life. And then you become poor. Or just in California, like it's a physical fact that we've had a bunch of blackouts. I live in California, like because of irrational actions. So there's some Ayn Rand quote that's something like, you can evade reality, but you can't evade the consequences of evading reality. Like, now, the only exception to that, which she points out in many other contexts, is you can, with political injustice, you can force people to pay for your mistakes. So like if you're Gavin Newsom, you can contribute to these blackouts, but then presumably he's got a bunch of generators on his, that are serving him so that he isn't as affected by these kinds of things. But in general, we all, cause and effect is a real thing. And so it is generally in our interest to identify what kinds of causes lead to what sorts of beneficial effects for what we care about, which I think should overwhelmingly be the well-being or the flourishing of human beings. And discovering those facts is essential. The only reason to where we are is because enough people have discovered those facts. And I also think people are open to those.
Yeah.
I'm very reluctant to accept that, people just believe things because it's propaganda or irrational. I think in general, my side, if you want to call it that, on fossil fuels has done a very bad job of explaining why the truly scientific position, or at least a truly objective position, is to be pro fossil fuels. I think there's been often there's this false alternative we allow between climate change believer and climate change denier. I just in general think that, or some people just say stuff like global warming is a hoax without looking into anything. There are a lot of reasons. So my basic idea in terms of persuasion is I always assume there's a better way to explain things to people. And I'm very interested in that versus people just go by, we could talk about this particular claim, people just go by emotion, nobody's open to reason. When you first discover truths, you can definitely feel that way legitimately. But when you start to see how poorly people on the side of the truth explain it, it gives you some optimism that if you explained it better, you'd win over more people.
Yeah, that's really good. And that kind of gets into the next set of questions that I want to ask. But real quick, before we jump to that next set, I think this is an important one to kind of on the last topic. Do you think that it's the green movement or the renewables movement is held to the same standard around the fact checking and the misinformation? And, you see all these headlines like it's the warmest year on record. I see that one all the time when I, grew up with the OG climate scientist, a geologist, right? And I could have learned about when I was younger that the world used to be like a tropical rainforest and there were no polar ice caps for the majority of life since the Cambrian explosion. Multicelled organisms, there's been less time when there is ice caps and there is more ice caps, yet there is just a fixation on headlines that say things like this is the warmest year ever, or we're on record for record ice cap melting, or just these things that maybe they're quoting a study and that's how they get around it. But you just see a lot of sensationalist headlines that I think if hard pressed, it would be difficult for those people to back those up, strictly factually to say these are true facts. Yet I'm not seeing those people getting taken off of LinkedIn.
Yeah. So as you might imagine, my answer to the question is no, people are not held to the same standards at all. I mean, there's just even I'm not easily shocked. I am shocked by the amount of dishonesty that occurs, particularly with the so-called renewables, but it's mainly solar and wind, so I call them unreliables. Just the idea that these companies can claim, like Apple and Facebook, and like they claim we're 100% renewable, when just in reality they're on the grid, they're using mostly fossil fuels and nuclear, and literally what's happening is they are paying utilities to get credit for all the solar and wind that everyone else is using. And then they pay the utilities to give the blame for their fossil fuels and nuclear to everybody else. I mean, this is just this should be a class action lawsuit. It's totally, which I would encourage anyone to do. You don't have to include me in it. But just think about why does, and you can multiply these examples. I mean, the thing you talk about, like on record, how much misleading there is about just the history of this planet and this whole idea that we're at unprecedented levels of CO2 and temperature. Why there's example after example. In my book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, I give a bunch. And there's one guy in particular, a guy named Steven Schneider, who's a prominent climate scientist between the 70s and the 90s. And he has this kind of immortal line about we have to decide what's the right balance between being ethical. Oh, no, wait. Oh, see, I don't remember it, but it's something like, it's being effective and being honest. And
right.
That's that doesn't get you kicked out of academia. No, it's like, oh, that's a reasonable thing. So what's going on? I think what's going on is there's a prevailing narrative, like what you can call a moral narrative, about the right way for society to go forward. And this moral narrative, so the narrative is we need to rapidly eliminate fossil fuel use and replace it with renewables. That's the basic moral narrative of our society. And then I've indicated so far, I think that's based on a certain kind of framework that says that our goal should be to minimize the planet, minimize our impact on the planet as much as possible. So have as little impact as possible. And then the planet is a delicate nurturer that will take care of us as long as we don't impact it too much. I think there's that framework, which leads very logically to this idea that we need to eliminate fossil fuels, which are having all this impact, and we need to replace it with renewables. And because it has this moral narrative, people think, well, they're always looking for facts or claims to fact that support the narrative. And they're always wary of claims to fact that counter the narrative. So when there's a claim to fact like, hey, Germany gets 50% of its energy from solar and wind, like, oh, that sounds great, right? That confirms my narrative. We call this confirmation bias. But there's this license. There's so much of what's going on with this fact checking. And even if you look at who's driving it, it's mostly these ideological groups, like these very strong agenda groups like Greenpeace, Sierra Club. They have an agenda of eliminating fossil fuels. And so they're saying you need to do more fact checking against all the people who are saying that we shouldn't eliminate fossil fuels. But then Greenpeace and Sierra Club, I mean, does anyone believe these are paragons of factual accuracy? No. But I would love to know how many times LinkedIn has corrected a false claim about renewable energy.
Yeah.
Or even climate catastrophism. Like if they could show me 10 instances, I will give them all of the platforms. Facebook, Twitter. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, if you combine them, are there 10 instances of people being corrected for making falsely positive claims about renewable energy? If that's not true, because I guarantee I could find 1 million of them if I had enough resources, I think that would be a very revealing study.
Yeah, it kind of brings into question, what's the purpose of fact checkers? And this is something that I've often thought about. I mean, there's just no possible way on the internet or the social media particularly to fact check there's millions and millions of daily posts, and the feasibility behind actually checking facts that's one thing, right? Like, it's just not feasible. Two, it's like, why does it matter? Like, we all have Google. I mean, like, shouldn't we be able to just, if we see something that we think is false, like, why is there this obligation? And again, this probably could be like a whole pause. So I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole, but I just don't understand what the point of the fact checking is. Maybe it's because the comment I made earlier about more and more information, people are getting dumber, which was a joke, but I think some truth to that, right? It's like there's so much out there that you can't figure out what's real and what's false. But I just don't get the fact checking. It's never going to be right. You're never going to be able to fact check every post. Let's just face it. And even if you could, I don't know necessarily that that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? There's so much ambiguity and nuance in virtually everything. So anyways,
yeah, again, I mean, there's a lot to say about it, because there's this question of, like, if you run a social media platform, what do you want to do in terms of certain kinds of false things that somebody might say that might be incendiary? And I think in general, like, you want to focus on things like calls to violence.
Right.
There are certain reasons why certain communities might want to do these things, but I think for our purposes, the point is just, it is very hazardous to think that you are going to be able to it's like fact check, but it's not just facts, it's conclusions about the world. I mean, even this thing by Biden was like this prediction about, oh, if you pass my policy, we're going to be just drowning in these amazing green jobs and everything will be great. Like, is that a fact? Well, I mean, I say the facts lead to the opposite conclusion, but it's in the future. So is it a fact?
Right.
Just, you need to, in general, what we need to value is a society of intellectual competition where you earn reputations. And part of it is certain institutions earn better reputations than others. And I think the thing to do is to give people the ability to curate things by the, based on who's earned their trust. I mean, I have this is a kind of a random thing for people, but I actually have a new kind of platform that I've created with my co-founder, is a guy named Brian Amridge, who used to work at Facebook and was very prominent in some of the stuff at Facebook. And it's not available yet, but you can sign up preliminarily. It's at thoughtful.community. And in any case, we've thought a lot about what's our content policy. And basically the way we do it, at least right now, is on Thoughtful, you only get things that come from people that you have chosen to get them from. So basically you can follow certain people on Thoughtful and then they'll curate it. Like on Thoughtful, you can follow somebody who has views that I consider horrible. Like you could follow a racist, or what I would call a human racist, like somebody who hates humans, which I think is unfortunately a very palatable form of racism. Like you can do whatever you want, but I'm not going to see that content, because I have to choose to follow people. So in that case, we're respecting that it's really hard to know what's true. So we're allowing you to curate your own experience. That's probably not the only way to do it, but we are terrified of the idea of, oh, Alex Epstein, or partner Brian Amridge, like, we're going to tell you what you can think about and not. I think that's generally a very unhealthy thing to do in the intellectual world.
Yeah, that's like the opposite of the Reddit model, with the moderators and the upvotes and just the massive echo chamber, which again could probably be a whole pod, but there's, and
they're like, they ban climate denial, right?
They just ban like anything, really. They just don't like you. Reddit is a weird place, but it's a good place for some things. Like you can get on it and follow some cool communities, but at the same time, the way that it's set up, it like rewards groupthink, which is a really good segue into the next segment, which I'll kind of want to talk about some of these, keeping it on the philosophical theme, some of these paradoxes that we live in. And George Orwell coined this phrase called doublethink, and it's basically holding two simultaneous yet contradictory beliefs in your mind at the same time, but believing both of them are true. And that is, effectively where we are at today. You've got this news about the North Face, and this is like all this last week. I don't know when this will air, but this was happening while this was recorded. And this CEO from a oil and gas company, and this, by the way, is not a new thing. I mean, years ago, half a decade ago, I knew of friends that were that tried to order a Patagonia with their company label on it, and same story as this North Face story that just dropped. And it was, I don't know exactly how it was said, but it was basically, you don't meet our standards. We don't put our logo on fossil fuel company stuff. So we're in this reality where these companies are effectively, they're selling petrochemicals. I mean, a large portion. I mean, these are all blends, right? Like it's not just cotton or wool. I mean, they have synthetics and these materials that are clearly made from fossil fuels. You've got most camping equipment. And I've seen a bunch of stuff on this recently just because of the North Face thing, but there's just this whole outdoor lifestyle, very fossil fuels influenced. And yet these companies, it's just paradoxical that they, are selling these products, yet won't let the suppliers of their products have their logo on their shirts. Like, how do we, again, like kind of putting your philosopher hat on, like, how do we get to this point?
It is a really interesting thing. I've been thinking about it more over the past few years, and I don't feel like I fully understand what's going on But there is this dynamic where the anti-fossil fuel movement has had this ingenious strategy of enabling you to be against something and to get the virtue of it, even if you consume it a lot.
Right.
So I just, this comes up sometimes because I was in a cab I was in a cab. The CEO was consulting with me on some messaging and he asked me, hey, I'm in a cab and the guy tells me like, I hate oil. And I just thought, well, my response would be, well, it seems like you really like it because you're using it for your job. Yeah. And I wouldn't say it quite in that tone, but like, it seems like what you're saying is you don't think oil is perfect. You might think there are some downsides or side effects, but you think the benefits outweigh it. And well, that's pretty much what I think too. So I do think there is this important issue of it's very valuable and really crucial for people to recognize that fossil fuels are ubiquitous in the world. They're ubiquitous as energy. They're 80+% of the world's energy. At least as of 2019, they're the world's fastest growing source of energy. 2020 has been an aberration in so many different ways, but they've been the fastest growing source of energy in absolute terms for decades. So they're completely dominant in transportation, completely dominant in industrial process heat, and then they are completely vital in terms of all the raw materials in our civilization, which you're getting at with North Face and Patagonia. It's really important for us to recognize, A, that they are ubiquitous, and then B, that is our choice. Like North Face is choosing to use fossil fuels. We're choosing to drive gasoline-powered cars. Why? Because we judge that as the thing that's best for our lives. The other things aren't nearly as cost effective. And therefore, if we couldn't use oil and gas, the things that we like today either wouldn't exist or they would be more expensive or a third thing, they'd be lower quality. And so it's just important that North Face chooses to use fossil fuels. And there should be a big stigma against choosing to use something and then condemning the producer that you asked to produce it. One more quick analogy I used once is I have this I Love Fossil Fuel shirt that I wear. And I thought that, you know, if somebody had like an I Hate Fossil Fuels shirt on, like that would be considered totally acceptable, like to go on a plane and stuff with an I Hate Fossil Fuel shirt. But for me, that's like if you had an I Hate Pilots shirt on a plane. Like they'd say, get the hell off my plane. Like you hate pilots. Pilots make this possible. Well, fossil fuels make this possible just as much as pilots. And so the idea that, I'm against oil. They often say I didn't choose this. Like, no, you are choosing this. Anyone can choose to be poor. And you're choosing to not be poor because you think this is the best thing for your life. And you should embrace this. And you definitely should not be able to blame it just on the people that you ask to produce it, let alone sue them and all these other injustices that are occurring.
Absolutely. And this year, you know, one of the big things I've kind of focused on or that I've noticed is that the big hero, if you really want to boil down COVID-19 and the reason why so many lives were saved, you can look really at fossil fuels and think about N95 masks and ventilators and the laboratory equipment that these vaccines are developed with. And none of this stuff can be made with wind or solar. These are things that truly you have to have fossil fuels to make a ventilator. There's just, maybe you could make one out of glass or some other type of method that would, you know, effectively get you somewhere similar to the product that they're using. But I would say that for COVID, you know, this has been a giant factor as to why doctors have been able to save so many lives, yet virtually no acknowledgement of, you know, to use your book's title, the moral aspect of these products are providing all this good, yet it's been quite the opposite. You know, this was an election year, so a lot of negative publicity for fossil fuels, while at the same time we're able to save millions of lives because of these products. It's just, again, it's just such a paradox. It's just a weird phenomenon that we kind of live in.
Well, that is a story that really should be told, as well as all the energy aspects of it. I tweeted recently, the Pfizer vaccine needs to be refrigerated at negative 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, who wants a wind turbine refrigerating their vaccine? Nobody.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. If it cut out, it would, if you lost power, it would, you know, the temperature would would fall or would rise, and it would compromise the vaccine. So you need something that's totally reliable.
So yeah, it really reinforces rather the importance of reliability. And then what you're talking about in terms of these products, I mean, we need these products, we needed them as quickly as possible. We need them as high quality as possible. This is not something where you can just screw around and say, hey, let's try using corn. Maybe that would be fun. Like if, for a drinking water bottle or something like that, or as let's do this as on a lark. Like lives are on the line. You need to produce the best stuff as well as possible. There's a reason why you're using, natural gas power plants and then natural gas and oil made products, and the industry should be even more vocal about that. I did see that Energy Transfer, the pipeline/infrastructure company, they had a pretty good post recently, and I thought that was good. I think one thing that should just be emphasized is the reason we're using oil and gas for these things is because they are the best, cheapest, or only way to do these things. It's not some random thing that like John D. Rockefeller somehow imposed this on us or some conspiracy. Like we're using this for the same reason we use anything else, because it's the best, cheapest, or only way to do what we want to do.
Yeah. But Time Magazine is not going to put fossil fuels on the front of it as the big reason why 2020 we were able to make it through this crisis, though.
Yeah. I mean, they thought it was good that, oh yeah, well, we're not using as much fossil fuel. And they're like, oh, it's so good for it's so, what they call it, like so good for the environment. And just think about if you think about environment in the broadest sense, like what kind of world do we live in? Like, was it a better world this year or a worse world this year? It was a much worse world this year. And that's what it means to live in a human environment that's deprived of energy. That's a bad place.
Right. And so to my next set of questions is kind of like what we define as good and what we define as bad. And I think that this has really evolved in the energy space just in my career. And I've had another guest on another episode where we talk about this a little bit, but it seems like I've been in the energy industry for about 10 years. And when I first got into the industry, it was Gasland and a lot of these, very focused on what I'll call the micro issues, right? So pointing to, for example, fracking and saying, fracking is going to contaminate water, drinking water, or pointing to a specific infrastructure project and saying, this infrastructure is going to, disrupt this species, or it's going to affect this community because of, they're going to breathe in the emissions from this specific project. And I've seen a big shift, and it's not that those issues aren't still brought up, but those were kind of like the mainstream primary talking points I felt like 10 years ago. Whereas now there's been an obvious shift to climate change, and specifically they've honed in on emissions. And so I'll talk about that a little bit, but it doesn't seem like, you mentioned earlier in the pod that the idea was to have less of an impact. And I don't know that that's true. I think there's certain impacts they're willing to accept, and other impacts, are totally off limits. And that is primarily around emissions, which, let's face it, that's due to combustion, which is how you consume fossil fuels as an energy. And it's all just really convenient, right? Because back then, 10 years ago, we could point to the Gasland documentary and you could go in and you could debunk, well, hey, look, this water wasn't really contaminated. Here's the data. Here's the science. We didn't really disrupt the species. Now, with the argument with climate change, I mean, this is based off of predictions, right? So it's not, here's what happened, I can debunk that. It is, here's what's going to happen 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years from now. If you're arguing with me, then, it's not a good thing for you publicly to deny these things or to even argue with these things. But the industry has found itself in a place where the other side, I feel like, has gotten really smart, right? Because now it's all based off of predictions instead of actual cause and effect. And so anyways, it just seems like that's where it's gone. And I feel like that was a calculated thing to get us to this point. So just your thoughts on like how we define good and bad when it comes to energy consumption, because it feels like it's evolved over the last, decade or so.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So let's see. It seems like there are a couple issues here. So one is that this is a point that Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace, makes, and he has a new book coming out next year about this. Something like invisible catastrophes is a key element of it. And his point is that a lot of the so-called basis for getting rid of fossil fuels and other forms of industry are things that we can't see. And it's broader than just energy. It's things like, oh, GMOs are evil. And it's like, well, you can't see a GMO. You can't see that, but it's labeled that way. And it's like, okay, what does it actually do to you? You don't know. I mean, what's chemically different about it? You don't know. But it's like, oh, you think, you hear, oh my gosh, if this happens, then it's going to be some cascade, et cetera, et cetera. And, those things, they have the advantage of they cannot, you can't debunk them as easily because people can't see them. They have the disadvantage, and I think this is why the fracking stuff was used earlier. They're not as immediate to people in most cases. But the thing is, when you make the immediate points, when something is new, like fracking was perceived as new, you have a certain time horizon where you can scare the hell out of people, but then it becomes normalized in their lives. And they see, oh no, wait, the water is not just terrible. Yeah, it seems like this guy was at least exaggerating. Oh, I see a lot of jobs are coming from this. My heating bill is lower. My electricity bill is lower. Although electricity bill, not so much because solar and wind made it more expensive. But they're seeing these, a place like Pennsylvania is seeing a boom related to fracking. So I think that it had a kind of shelf life that was limited, whereas this focus on the invisible things can be more unlimited. And what they're really good at is, instead of like proving their case that this is actually going to be a problem for you, because that's really hard to do. It's really hard to argue. Not only is it hard to predict climate, but it's hard to even think of something that could plausibly happen with climate that we would have a real problem adapting to. Like, I've tried to do it. It's actually quite hard to think of, like, okay, how much would temperatures have to rise? Like, what would have to happen with wildfires? We could go into any of these, but like, human beings are really good at dealing with these things, to the point that I like to point out climate-related deaths have gone down by 98%. So the death rate for people dying from storms and flood, extreme heat, extreme cold, et cetera, all these things, like, we're safer from those than ever, despite the 1 degree increase in global average temperature in the last 170 years that's supposedly so bad. And the reason is because the reason we're much safer is because climate hasn't changed all that much. We don't even know if it's negative or positive on balance, but our ability to deal with climate has just radically improved. And we can trace that to low cost, reliable, versatile energy. That's what powers all the machines that in one way or another are keeping us safe from climate and make our whole civilization so durable. So I think that they, instead of like having an actual argument for how this is going to hurt your life, I mean, they have kind of random fear things. I think it's just so much appealing to these invisible things, and then appealing to scientific authority, and then repeating words like existential threat, climate crisis, like all of these things. And really part of the genius is saying you can't even discuss it. Like, you can't discuss that this, because again, if you actually have to demonstrate that we are causing catastrophic climate change, like, nobody can really do that. That's different than showing that we're having some warming impact on the atmosphere. Like, you really need to show we're having something that's going to be really overwhelming, when we're actually, what we've been doing for 170 years has been making us safer than ever. And then that's going to be reversed, and it's going to get worse than it is naturally. You can't really make a good argument. So they just use intimidation.
Well, they can't even make a good argument around just reducing emissions, because we have the technology today. So the next question is, look, we can reduce emissions. We have reduced emissions. We've done a great job, really, if you look at us compared to some of the other major powers in the world, primarily driven by natural gas and the switch from coal to natural gas in the power gen sector, and also some of the regulations on transportation, et cetera. There's been things that we've done where we've reduced emissions. Certainly nuclear would be a massive step forward in reducing, a lot of emissions. I mean, not on the transportation side, but on the power gen side. Yet when it really comes down to it, and you've talked about it a few times on the pod, it's solar and wind. And you start to think, okay, well, any type of plan that involves natural gas or something that we could look, I don't know, I can't remember the ratios, like nat gas is like 30 times less pollutant than coal and 10 times than oil or something. There's these ratios.
It depends what you're talking about. CO2, they're not that far. I mean, coal is twice gas and oil is in the middle.
Gotcha. Well, I've just seen some things where there's like, it can be reduced dramatically through natural gas and through existing technologies and existing infrastructure, more importantly, right? Like we don't have to create a new fuel cell or do these things. We have it today. And yet it seems to come back to solar and wind. And really, it feels like all arguments kind of lead back. And this is sort of the cynical way to view it, but it all sort of leads back to something that has to be either subsidized by the government or the government has to have a major role in the answer. They're not pushing solutions forward that private enterprise or that capitalism could tackle. It is very much focused on government, either subsidized or programs that are driven through the government. And I'm just wondering, is that by design? Is there a place where we can have fossil fuels that help achieve these goals that they're trying to achieve? Because look, we have the technology, we have the resources to do it. Seems like there's resistance to that. What's your thoughts?
I think just emissions is a packaging of things that's important. There's a difference between CO2 emissions and then like conventional particulate type things like sulfur dioxide and what they'll call PM 2.5 and those kinds of things. And certainly with natural gas, all those things leaving aside CO2 are very low. And even with modern coal plants, they're quite low. The issue of CO2 is CO2, we don't have a good way to reduce. I mean, if you go from gas to coal, you reduce it by 50%. But in a growing economy, we still should be emitting more CO2. And if you look at what's causing the biggest dips in CO2, it's things like 2008 recession, certainly 2020, I think beyond recession. So if you look at just, I think to grow, I mean, leaving aside nuclear, and I'll bring it back to that in a second, but if you just talk about the fossil fuels, if we have a growing economy using fossil fuels, our emissions will go up over time. I mean, there might be some dips if you're using more natural gas versus coal, and I think that should be done when that makes economic sense, which that's not always done when it makes economic sense, like shutting down coal plants that are already paid for and replacing them with natural gas plus solar and wind. Like I think those are generally economic debacles. But let's say that natural gas for the next 30 years was the most competitive. And so gradually you replaced your power plants with natural gas. Sure, you'd be lower emissions baseline, but your emissions, if we're a growing economy, again, would still go up. So there is this point that for the world to be prosperous in the coming decades, emissions need to go up. They certainly cannot go way, way down like people are talking about. And that is something people have to think about. They have to realize if you want like emissions going down to zero is just not going to happen at all. But if you want emissions to go significantly down, and when they go down, that still means CO2 levels rise in the atmosphere. It just means they rise less slowly. Like that means you are going to have much more expensive energy around the world. And you have to decide, you have to recognize that. And then if you think about energy any way like I do, like, hey, this is the industry that powers every other industry, the higher cost this is, the higher cost everything is, then you start to think of it as, okay, I'm going to create a humanitarian crisis to lower emissions. Well, I don't think that's worth it. But I think people should recognize that trade-off, so to speak. In terms of nuclear, though, what you're saying about natural gas does apply to nuclear. That is, you can produce electricity using nuclear, and there's some emissions, but it's very low compared to like coal and oil and gas, because the basic method of generating energy is not emitting CO2. And this is something that we have done in this country on a large scale. And what's really revealing, which I think you're getting at, is the anti-fossil fuel movement is rabidly anti-nuclear. And they've done everything they can to shut down nuclear plants. They've made it prohibitively expensive to build. The build time has gone from something like 4 years to 14 years, which just makes it prohibitively expensive to do. There's just all these pseudo safety regulations that make no sense, that just make it, they virtually criminalize nuclear. And at the same time, you have all of these subsidies, like what are called the production tax credit for wind and the investment tax credit for solar. And these and many other things, what they basically do is they give preference to unreliable solar and wind over every reliable technology, including nuclear. So the green movement is just making nuclear totally impractical. And yet that's really the only plausible thing that could lower emissions and still be part of a prosperous and growing society. So what that indicates is their goal is not to reduce emissions, and certainly not to reduce emissions while improving human life. And that leads to the question of what is their goal? And I think in terms of the leaders of it, not most people, but the leaders of it, they really want a planet where human beings are a much, much smaller presence. And so their real issue with fossil fuels and nuclear and hydro is that these are part of human beings humanizing the planet and having a lot of impact on the planet. And they just think that's wrong. They think it's wrong for us to impact the planet. They think there should be far fewer of us in their unguarded moments. They'll talk about the Earth should have 1 billion people. The Earth should have 2 billion people max. We should be using much less energy. It's really their goal is a dehumanized Earth, but they've sold it to us. They have all their dehumanizing Earth policies, but they sell them to us as, if you follow my dehumanizing Earth policy, it'll save you from a climate disaster. But if you look at what they're actually advocating, it's not at all what would save you from a climate disaster. If they're a climate disaster, what would save you from a climate disaster, somewhat on their terms, is nuclear, which they oppose.
But I think like a lot of the people, you're saying the leaders and some of these people that maybe the policymakers or the people that are potentially the driving force behind some of these things. But I would say, and we're getting close on time, so kind of the last major question is kind of a loaded question, but I would say that most people, myself included, would say, look, if there's a path forward where we could be cleaner, where we could be better, whether that be from a, just an impact, right? I'm not saying necessarily emissions. I just mean in general, if you can do better, from, not only creating energy that's abundant and cheap and that helps the poorest people and that progresses humanity, but you could do that in a way that is more efficient or better than the way that we're currently doing it. I think most people would say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And certainly public opinion right now it feels like, to me at least, kind of overwhelmingly in that camp of we should be doing better. And so because the renewables technologies, and whether you can point to the ones we've talked about, but in general, let's just talk about technology. It's got sort of a trend to it, right? Which is that 10, 20, 30 years ago, things that seemed unfathomable are just commonplace today. And you can only extrapolate that to think that in 10, 20, 30 years from now, things today that seem unfathomable will be commonplace then. Is there a path? Is there, number one, redeemable things in the green movement to where we're actually going to progress, energy and humanity in a good direction? I mean, certainly if all these renewable initiatives get pushed forward, there's going to have to be a massive amount of industrial progress to get there. I don't know if you see what I did there, but my point is that, like, I think a lot of people want this to happen, whether or not they're misinformed. And certainly with what you and I have seen in our lifetime through technology, it's not uncomprehendable to think that some of these things we're talking about how it's inefficient or it doesn't make sense, could potentially in a rapid period of time be the other way. Is there a path to work together with the green and renewables movement to help get this to a place where energy can be something that is cleaner, more efficient, and it kind of satisfies both sides, or is that an unattainable thing?
Well, there are a lot of issues in that final question. So let's talk about, it's really important, when you're talking about alignment, to be aligned on a goal. So if you're talking about in the sense of, are there a lot of people who have different opinions on this issue, who genuinely want the world to be a better place to live? And I mean a better place to live primarily for human beings, which includes like beautiful environment and clean air and clean water. But ultimately, because that's the kind of world that human beings want to live in. Like if we agree on that, and we agree on the power of technology to make that happen, and energy is a value, yeah, I think a lot of people can be aligned on that. But I don't think, and I think many people who consider themselves part of the green movement fall into that category. But I think we shouldn't think of it as the green movement. We should think of it as the human flourishing movement, as in we want the world to be a better place for human flourishing in all kinds of different respects. But if you look at the green movement, like the core leadership of it, there's a very strong anti-human element to it. And that's what I was getting at before. It's not just that they're against impacts that make our environment dirty or that destroy natural beauty. There's really an opposition to impact as such. Like if you look at being green, so much of it is like being against industry, saying, you should drive less, saying we shouldn't build a new housing development, saying we should have fewer factories, saying we shouldn't have industrial agriculture. And it's not because they have emissions and stuff. It's because it's just viewed as wrong to have such an impact on the earth. And that's where I think you need to be clear and say, no, I disagree with that. I think it's good for human beings to impact the earth as long as we do so productively and intelligently. In fact, that's the only thing that allows us to enjoy the earth, is that we impact it so much that we free up all this time and ability to go and enjoy beautiful places and to clean the water that's naturally dirty, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that my own focus is really framing the thing so that we can get a lot of people on board, where like our goal is, better world for human flourishing. And then we recognize that energy is really important. And with all the different options, we really look at the full context. We really look carefully at the benefits and the side effects, and we weigh them. And I think if you have that kind of perspective, then you can get a lot of people involved. And then in terms of the technologies, I think what you would get is you'd get a more even-handed and rational approach to these things. And you wouldn't have this bias that, oh, we need to use the sun and the wind. You would say, hey, let's look at all different kinds of options. Let's let them compete. For God's sake, why are we restricting nuclear? It doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't be focused on the greenest energy. You'd be focused on the best energy, the most cost-effective.
But if they competed from a capitalism, from a dollar allocation, they were the most competitive. Then you would be on that side of it.
Yeah, of course, that would be great. Because fossil fuels are just a means to an end. They're means to empowering human beings. But it's important that the whole focus, what you mentioned, people want solar and wind. Like, they want solar and wind for these philosophical reasons, because they think it's somehow more natural. And if you look in reality, it's a massive impact in so many different ways. So it's not actually a low impact, but it's this idea that, we should minimize our impact. We have no real right to change the earth very much. And I think that's the wrong way to judge energy sources. And so a lot of the stuff around solar and wind, why people want it, but also all of these completely dishonest claims, I believe, about how cost effective they are now, I think it's all being driven by this moral bias toward being green. So I'm all for those things being free to compete, but looking at it from a pro-human perspective, not from this green perspective where you're so biased in favor of these unreliables, as I call them, that are really failures. They're really making electricity more expensive and less reliable around the world. There's a lot of dishonesty around that, but wherever they're being used, they're driving up prices. So right now, there's not an energy transition to something better. There's an energy regression to something worse. And it's ideologically motivated. And I'm trying to get us to think about these issues in a more pro-human way, not so we can stick with fossil fuels forever, but so that we can have evolving energy that includes fossil fuels, as long as that makes sense, which I think will be a long time.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And I know you're butting up against a time crunch here, so I won't push it further. I think that last question you could probably talk for a long time on, but no, it's been great. I love your perspectives on this stuff. It's one of those things that, again, kind of from the beginning of the podcast, just the way you frame the arguments and the way you look at it, what I would consider objectively. You made the point that maybe everybody considers themselves objective. That's probably not too far from the truth, but specifically with the way that you put things forward, I feel like you're doing a good job when it comes to crafting the argument in a way that I feel is productive, at least. So, but again, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great talking to you here for this last hour, and I'll be following what you do moving forward. And again, I just appreciate it.
Thanks. And congratulations on the new show. Excited to see how it turns out. And then just if anyone is interested in my work, I'm on all the traditional channels, but also if you want to be on my mailing list, which is probably the best thing I do, it's alexepsteinlist.com.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just got one of your notes today. It was good. But again, thanks so much. And hopefully we'll talk again. Thanks, Alex.
All right. Thanks, Max.